The autumn rain drummed against the windows of the Pine Valley Animal Shelter that Tuesday morning, each droplet carrying with it the weight of another difficult day ahead. I've been running this shelter for 12 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything. Every heartbreak, every miracle, every soul that walked through these doors, both human and canine. But nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to witness in the next few hours. I was reviewing the morning reports when Sarah, one of our volunteers, burst through my office door with tears streaming down her face. "Director Mitchell," she gasped, barely able to catch her breath. "You need to see what they brought in last night." Following her through the maze of kennels, past the familiar chorus of barks and whimpers that had become the soundtrack of my life, I could feel my heart preparing itself for another devastating sight. We'd had 17 dogs surrendered just that week. The economic downturn had forced too many families to make impossible choices. But as we approached Kennel 34, tucked away in the corner where we kept the most critical cases, nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. There, huddled in the far corner of the concrete enclosure, was what appeared to be a medium-sized dog, though it was hard to tell through the matted fur and accumulated dirt. But it wasn't his disheveled appearance that made my breath catch in my throat. It was his paws. All 4 of them were wrapped in makeshift bandages that had long since turned brown with dried blood and mud. The dog's eyes, barely visible through the tangled mess of what might have once been golden fur, held the exhaustion so profound it seemed to echo through the very air around him. "Found him behind the old Walmart on Route 9, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain. "Been there for weeks according to the security guard, living off scraps from the dumpster." She paused, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "The worst part is people have been laughing at him, actually pointing and laughing because of the way he walks." I knelt down slowly, my knees protesting against the cold concrete floor. The dog didn't move, didn't even acknowledge my presence. His breathing was shallow, labored, and I could see the slight tremor that ran through his body with each exhale. This wasn't just physical pain. This was the kind of soul-deep weariness that comes from surviving when survival seems impossible. "Has Dr. Peterson seen him yet?" I asked, though my eyes never left the broken creature before me. "She's on her way, but—" Sarah's voice trailed off, and I knew what she wasn't saying. We both knew the protocol. With our resources stretched thin and 33 other dogs already waiting for homes that might never come, a dog in this condition, requiring extensive medical care and rehabilitation, would typically be considered a candidate for humane euthanasia. It was the harsh reality of shelter life that kept me awake most nights. The dog shifted slightly, and for the first time he looked at me. Not past me, not through me, but directly at me. His eyes were brown, the color of rich coffee, and despite everything he'd endured, despite the pain that must have been coursing through his entire body, there was something in those eyes that hit me like a physical blow to the chest. It wasn't hope. Hope requires energy this dog simply didn't have. It was something deeper, something more fundamental. It was trust. Inexplicable, unearned trust offered by a creature who had every reason to fear the human species. "What's his story?" I asked, standing slowly, my mind already racing through possibilities, resources, potential complications. "Anonymous surrender. Someone dropped him at the night drop with just a note that said, 'Found him like this, can't help.' No name, no history, nothing." Sarah looked down at her clipboard, flipping through pages with shaking hands. "The overnight staff estimated he's maybe 4 or 5 years old, probably some kind of retriever mix, but honestly it's hard to tell in his current state." Dr. Peterson arrived 20 minutes later, her usually cheerful demeanor sobering the moment she laid eyes on the dog. I watched her work, noting the gentle way she spoke to him as she examined his wounds, the careful precision with which she unwrapped the crude bandages someone had applied to his paws. What we found underneath made my stomach turn. "Severe lacerations on all 4 pads," she reported, her voice clinical but strained. "Some are infected, others are healing poorly. Looks like he's been walking on broken glass or rough concrete for an extended period. The good news is there's no sign of broken bones. The bad news is he's severely malnourished, dehydrated, and these wounds are going to require surgery and weeks of careful rehabilitation." As she spoke, I found myself studying the dog more closely. Beneath the dirt and matted fur, beneath the pain and exhaustion, I could see glimpses of who he might have been. The noble line of his head, the way he held his ears despite his obvious discomfort, the careful dignity with which he accepted Dr. Peterson's examination. This had been someone's beloved companion once. Someone had loved this dog, had played with him, had scratched behind his ears and told him he was a good boy. Director, Dr. Peterson's voice pulled me back to the present. Given his condition and our current capacity, I need to know how you want to proceed. The question hung in the air between us like smoke. I glanced around at the other kennels, each housing a dog with its own story, its own desperate need for a second chance. We were already operating at 150% capacity, with a waiting list of families looking to surrender their pets that stretched into next month. Our medical budget was stretched thinner than tissue paper, and the monthly board meeting was just days away where I'd have to explain every expenditure, justify every decision. But those eyes, those coffee brown eyes that had looked at me with such inexplicable trust. In 12 years of running this shelter, I'd learned to make the hard decisions, to think with my head instead of my heart. I'd had to. It was the only way to save as many as possible. But standing there in the fluorescent glow of the shelter lights, with the autumn rain painting everything gray outside, and the weight of 33 other lives pressing down on my shoulders, I felt something shift inside me. "We're going to save him," I heard myself say, the words emerging from someplace deeper than rational thought. "Whatever it takes, we're going to give him his chance." Sarah's eyes widened, and I saw Dr. Peterson exchange a meaningful glance with her. They both knew what this meant. The late nights, the additional expenses, the careful juggling of resources that was already stretched to its breaking point. But they also knew me well enough to recognize the tone in my voice. This wasn't a discussion, it was a declaration. As the day wore on, and Dr. Peterson prepared for the surgery that would begin the long road to healing, I found myself returning to Kennel 34 again and again. Each time, the dog was in the same position, watching the world with those wise, weary eyes. He didn't wag his tail when I approached. He didn't have the energy for that kind of optimism yet. But something had changed between us in that first moment of eye contact, some unspoken understanding that we were now connected in this journey together. The last time I checked on him before leaving for the day, I knelt down again and spoke to him for the first time. "I don't know your name," I said quietly, "and I don't know your story. But I promise you this, you're safe now. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, you're going to have your chance to remember what it feels like to be loved." As I drove home through the darkening streets of Pine Valley, past the suburban houses with their warm yellow windows and the certainty of family dinners waiting inside, I couldn't shake the image of those eyes. Somewhere between the shelter and my empty apartment, I realized that while I thought I was saving him, maybe, just maybe, he was about to save me too. And tomorrow would bring the real test of whether hope was stronger than circumstance, whether love could triumph over the cruel mathematics of shelter life. The surgery took 4 hours. 4 hours during which I paced the hallways of the shelter like an expectant father, checking and rechecking on the other dogs, reviewing adoption applications I'd already memorized, and drinking enough coffee to power a small city. Dr. Peterson had explained the procedure, cleaning and debriding the infected tissue, suturing the deeper lacerations, and applying protective dressings that would need to be changed daily for weeks. What she couldn't tell me was whether his spirit was strong enough to endure the recovery that lay ahead. When she finally emerged from the surgical suite, her scrub stained and her face drawn with exhaustion, I knew before she spoke that he had made it through. "He's stable," she said, pulling off her surgical gloves with hands that trembled slightly from fatigue. Surprisingly strong heart for a dog in his condition, but Robert, she used my first name, which she only did when the conversation was about to turn serious. "The recovery is going to be extensive. We're talking daily wound care, pain management, restricted movement for at least 3 weeks, followed by physical therapy to rebuild the muscle mass he's lost. And that's assuming no complications." I nodded, absorbing the implications. "What are we looking at cost-wise?" "Conservative estimate? 3,000, maybe more if there are complications." She paused, studying my face. "And that's just the medical care. He's going to need a quiet place to recover, someone who can be with him around the clock for the first week, specialized food, bedding that won't irritate his wounds. $3,000. In the context of human medicine, it was a drop in the bucket. In the world of shelter operations where we survived on donations that came in 20s and 50s from retirees who loved animals more than their own comfort, it was astronomical. It was also exactly what we'd allocated for the entire month's emergency medical fund. There's something else, Doctor. Peterson continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The Hendersons called this morning. They've decided they want to surrender Princess. Princess, the golden retriever who had been their family's constant companion for 8 years until their youngest child developed severe allergies. I knew the family, had spoken with them multiple times over the past month as they'd explored every possible alternative. They weren't giving up lightly. Mrs. Henderson had broken down in my office just last week, explaining how they'd already spent thousands on air purifiers, specialized cleaning and allergy treatments for their son. Nothing had worked. They're devastated, Doctor, Peterson added. But their boy ended up in the emergency room again last night. They can't wait any longer. Princess would be an easy placement. 8 years old, but still healthy, well-trained, beautiful, with a personality that charmed everyone she met. She'd have a new home within a week, 2 at the most, which meant I now had 34 dogs in a facility designed for 28, with resources that were already stretched beyond their limits. The next morning brought the monthly board meeting, and with it, the kind of scrutiny that made my palms sweat and my stomach churn. The Pine Valley Animal Shelter was technically a non-profit organization, but it operated more like a small business where every decision was subject to the approval of 7 well-meaning but often misguided board members who genuinely loved animals, but sometimes seemed to forget that loving them also meant making impossibly difficult choices. Margaret Thornton, the board president and Pine Valley's former mayor, sat at the head of the conference table in her perfectly pressed business suit, reading through the monthly financial report with the kind of focused intensity she'd once brought to city budget meetings. To her right sat Dr. James Crawford, a retired veterinarian whose donation had funded the shelter's construction, but whose medical knowledge was about 20 years out of date. The other 5 members rounded out the group: 2 local business owners, a retired teacher, and a wealthy widow whose late husband had left a substantial endowment that kept us operational. Robert, Margaret said, looking up from the financial statements, I'm seeing some unusual expenses in the medical category. A surgical procedure that cost almost $800? For a single animal? I felt my jaw tighten involuntarily. Yes, ma'am. We had a dog come in with severe injuries to all 4 paws. The surgery was necessary to prevent infection and give him a chance at recovery. And what's the adoption potential for this animal? Asked Tom Bradley, owner of 3 local hardware stores and a man who approached everything in life like a business transaction. Are we looking at a dog that will find a home quickly, or are we investing medical dollars in an animal that may be here for months? The question hung in the air like a challenge. I could feel the familiar weight of having to justify every act of compassion, every decision to save a life that wasn't immediately profitable in terms of adoption potential. It was the part of this job that made me question everything I thought I knew about humanity. The dog is a retriever mix, approximately 4 to 5 years old, I began, choosing my words carefully. With proper rehabilitation, he should make a full recovery and be an excellent candidate for adoption. Should, Dr. Crawford repeated, emphasizing the word. But given his current condition and the trauma he's experienced, there's no guarantee, is there? We've all seen dogs that never quite recover psychologically from severe neglect. I had seen those dogs, the ones who flinched at every human touch, who never learned to trust again, who spent months or years in shelters because their fear made them unadoptable. I'd also seen the miraculous transformations, the dogs who emerged from the darkest circumstances with a capacity for love that defied all logic. The problem was, you never knew which way it would go until you tried. There's never a guarantee with any animal, I said, fighting to keep my voice level. But in 12 years of doing this work, I've learned that sometimes the most broken souls have the most to give, once they're given the chance to heal. Margaret consulted her notes, her fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that matched my accelerating heartbeat. What about the other dogs? I understand we're currently at capacity with a waiting list. How many animals are we turning away to pour resources into this one case? The math was brutal and undeniable. The money spent on his surgery could have covered routine care for 6 healthy dogs. The time and attention he would require could have been spread across a dozen other animals. In purely utilitarian terms, the board's concerns were completely valid. But then I thought about those eyes, about the inexplicable trust I'd seen there, about the way he'd looked at me like I was his last hope in a world that had shown him nothing but cruelty. I thought about the people who had laughed at him as he struggled to walk on his wounded paws, about the anonymous surrender that had dumped him at our door like unwanted garbage. Sometimes, I said, my voice stronger now, carrying the conviction that had sustained me through a dozen years of these impossible decisions. The measure of who we are isn't found in the efficient allocation of resources. Sometimes it's found in our willingness to fight for the ones that no one else will fight for. The room fell silent. I could see the board members exchanging glances, the kind of careful political communication that happened in meetings where people were trying to find a way to say no without seeming heartless. Finally, Margaret spoke. Robert, no one questions your commitment or your judgment, but we have a responsibility to the community, to the other animals, to the donors who trust us to use their contributions wisely. We can't save them all, and every dollar we spend on one dog is a dollar we can't spend on the next 10 that come through our doors. She was right, of course. The mathematics of shelter life were unforgiving, and I'd built my career on making decisions based on logic rather than emotion. But sitting in that sterile conference room, surrounded by people who loved animals in theory, but seemed to have forgotten what it meant to love them in practice, I felt something crystallize inside me. I understand the financial constraints, I said, standing up slowly, and I understand the concern about resource allocation, but I'm not asking for permission to save this dog. I'm telling you that we're going to save him, and if that means I use my own vacation time to provide around-the-clock care, if it means I pay for his medical expenses out of my own pocket, then that's what I'll do. The silence that followed was deafening. In 12 years of board meetings, I'd never directly challenged their authority like this. I'd always been the diplomatic administrator, finding ways to work within their constraints while still doing right by the animals in our care. But something about this dog, about those eyes that had looked at me with such trust, had shifted something fundamental in my approach. Margaret cleared her throat. Robert, that's very admirable. But what about the next case like this? And the one after that? Where does it end? It ends, I said, gathering my papers and preparing to leave, when we stop being the kind of people who think love is a finite resource that has to be rationed. It ends when we remember that sometimes the most important thing we can do is show one broken soul that they matter, regardless of the cost. As I walked out of that conference room, I knew I'd probably just put my job in jeopardy. 12 years of building relationships, of carefully navigating the politics of nonprofit administration, of finding ways to save as many animals as possible within the constraints of budget and bureaucracy, all of it might be undone by my decision to fight for one wounded dog that most people had written off as hopeless. But as I walked back through the shelter, past the kennels filled with dogs who were all deserving of love and second chances, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Absolute certainty. Whatever the consequences, whatever the cost, I was going to give this dog everything I had. And maybe in the process I'd rediscover why I'd chosen this work in the first place. The decision was made at 3:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning when I found myself standing in the shelter at an hour when any reasonable person would have been home in bed. I'd been checking on him twice a day since the surgery, monitoring his progress, changing his bandages, making sure his pain medication was working. But something about that particular night felt different. Maybe it was the way the autumn wind howled around the building, or maybe it was the stark loneliness of the empty hallways, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he needed more than just medical care. He needed to remember what it felt like to be someone's dog. He was awake when I approached his kennel, which had become the norm. Sleep seemed to elude him, as if his body remembered too well what it meant to be vulnerable in the darkness. His eyes tracked my movement as I unlocked the kennel door, and for the first time since his surgery, he attempted to lift his head when I knelt beside him. "Hey there, buddy," I whispered, extending my hand slowly. He didn't pull away, but he didn't move toward me either. Trust, I was learning, was not a switch that could be flipped, but a bridge that had to be built one careful step at a time. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. "What do you say we get you out of here for a while?" The logistics of moving a dog with 4 bandaged paws were complicated, but not impossible. I'd brought my pickup truck that evening, ostensibly to transport supplies, but perhaps subconsciously preparing for this very moment. With infinite care and patience, I lifted him from the kennel, feeling the way his body tensed with pain despite the medication, feeling also the gradual relaxation as he seemed to understand that I wasn't going to hurt him. The drive to my apartment complex was conducted in complete silence, except for the soft country music playing on the radio, and the occasional whimper from the dog lying carefully arranged on blankets in the passenger seat. I lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a complex that was pet-friendly, but had never been home to anything larger than the occasional goldfish. As I carried him up the stairs, feeling his weight against my chest and the steady rhythm of his breathing, I wondered what I was really doing. Taking a severely injured shelter dog home wasn't just against protocol. It was the kind of decision that could cost me my job if the board found out. But as I settled him onto the pile of blankets I'd arranged in my living room, as I watched him slowly take in this new environment with those careful, observant eyes, I knew I'd made the right choice. This wasn't a kennel where he was surrounded by the constant noise and stress of other animals. This was quiet, warm, and most importantly, it was a place where he could begin to remember what it felt like to be the only dog in someone's world. The first week was brutal. Every 2 hours, day and night, I had to check his bandages, administer pain medication, and help him outside for bathroom breaks. Since he couldn't walk normally, these excursions required carrying all 60-plus pounds of him down a flight of stairs, holding him steady while he did his business, then carrying him back up. By the third day, every muscle in my back was screaming, and I was surviving on 3-hour stretches of sleep punctuated by the alarm I'd set to monitor his care schedule. But somewhere in the exhaustion, something beautiful began to happen. On the fourth night, when I woke up to check on him, I found that he'd managed to move closer to the couch where I'd been sleeping. Not dramatically, maybe a foot or two, but enough to close some of the distance between us. When I knelt down to check his bandages, he looked directly at me, and for the first time his tail moved. Just barely. Just once. But it was undeniably a wag. "There you are," I whispered, feeling tears I hadn't expected burning behind my eyes. "I knew you were in there somewhere." By the end of the first week, we'd established a routine that felt surprisingly natural. I'd wake up early, help him outside, prepare his special diet, high-protein foods designed to promote healing, and then sit with him while I had my coffee and reviewed shelter paperwork. He began to show interest in his surroundings, lifting his head when he heard birds outside the window, watching me move around the apartment with what appeared to be curiosity rather than fear. The breakthrough came on day 10. I was sitting on the floor next to him working on my laptop when I felt something brush against my arm. He had stretched his neck out and was actually resting his head against my forearm. It was such a simple gesture, the kind of casual contact that healthy dogs initiate dozens of times a day. But for him, it represented a monumental leap of faith. Here was a dog who had been abandoned, injured, mocked, and written off by most of the world, choosing to trust again. "We need to give you a name," I said softly, careful not to move my arm and disturb this precious contact. I'd been calling him Buddy or Boy since his arrival, but this felt like a moment that deserved something more permanent. Looking at him, at the noble line of his head and the quiet dignity with which he endured his recovery, one name kept coming to mind. "What about Cooper? Cooper suits you, doesn't it?" At the sound of the name, his ears perked up slightly. Whether it was recognition of the specific name or simply the gentle tone of my voice, I chose to believe it was approval. The second week brought new challenges and new victories. Cooper was beginning to put weight on his paws, though he still moved slowly and carefully. Dr. Peterson's daily visits to my apartment, officially unauthorized but absolutely necessary, showed that the healing was progressing better than expected. The infection had cleared completely, and new tissue was forming over the deepest wounds. More importantly, Cooper was beginning to show glimpses of personality. He had opinions about his food, enthusiastic approval of the high-quality kibble, polite rejection of vegetables. He had preferences about where he liked to rest, always where he could see both the front door and wherever I happened to be. And he had developed a morning ritual of watching me get ready for work with an expression that seemed to say, "You're coming back, right?" That unspoken question broke my heart every day. How many mornings had he watched someone leave, not knowing if they would return? How many times had he been let down by the people he'd chosen to love? The thought of his confusion and pain during those months of surviving on the streets injured and alone was almost unbearable, but it also made every small victory feel monumental. The first time he wagged his tail when I came home from work, the first time he initiated contact, gently nudging my hand with his nose when I was reading, the first time he fell asleep with his head resting on my foot, finally relaxed enough to be completely vulnerable in my presence. 3 weeks into his recovery, Cooper took his first real walk around the apartment complex. It was slow, careful, with frequent breaks, but he was walking on all 4 paws again. I watched him sniff at bushes and trees with the focused intensity of someone rediscovering a world they'd thought they'd lost forever. When we encountered Mrs. Martinez from apartment 3B walking her elderly beagle, Cooper didn't cower or pull away. Instead, he approached cautiously but confidently, allowing both the dog and the woman to greet him. "What a beautiful boy," Mrs. Martinez said, her eyes immediately going to the still visible scars on his paws. "He looks like he's been through something difficult." "He has," I replied, watching Cooper accept her gentle touches with a grace that astounded me. "But he's healing now. Aren't we all?" she said with the kind of smile that suggested she understood more than she was saying. That evening, as I sat on my couch with Cooper resting peacefully at my feet, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in my life. For the first time in years, my apartment felt like a home. The silence that had once felt oppressive now felt peaceful. The routines that had once felt empty now felt purposeful. And the constant worry about whether I was making the right decisions had been replaced by a quiet certainty that some things were simply meant to be. I thought about the board meeting, about Margaret's concerns regarding resource allocation, about the dozens of other dogs at the shelter who needed attention and care. All of those concerns were still valid, still required my attention and dedication, but they no longer felt like an overwhelming burden because I'd rediscovered something I'd forgotten in 12 years of shelter management: the transformative power of loving one soul completely. Cooper stirred at my feet, lifting his head to look at me with those coffee-brown eyes that had first captured my attention. In them, I no longer saw pain or weariness. I saw contentment, trust, and something that looked remarkably like love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new animals in need of help. But tonight, in this quiet apartment where a wounded dog had rediscovered hope and a lonely man had rediscovered purpose, everything felt exactly as it should be. The call came on a Tuesday morning in November, just as the first serious frost was painting the windows of my apartment, and Cooper had finally graduated to sleeping through the night without pain medication. Sarah's voice on the phone carried that particular tension that meant someone important was asking questions I might not want to answer. "Robert, Margaret Thornton is here. She wants to know why Cooper's kennel has been empty for 3 weeks, and she's asking some very specific questions about our medical expense reports." I looked over at Cooper, who was lying in a patch of morning sunlight by the living room window, his paws fully healed but still sensitive enough that he avoided rough surfaces. In the 6 weeks since his surgery, he'd gained 15 pounds of healthy weight. His coat had grown back thick and lustrous, and his confidence had blossomed in ways that constantly amazed me. More importantly, we'd developed the kind of bond that I'd seen between devoted dogs and their humans but had never experienced myself. "Tell her I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said, knowing that this conversation had been inevitable since the moment I'd decided to take Cooper home. The drive to the shelter felt longer than usual, partially because Cooper now rode shotgun with the alert interest of a dog who understood that car rides meant adventure, and partially because I was trying to figure out how to explain my actions to a board of directors who measured success in adoption rates and budget adherence, rather than the immeasurable value of second chances. Margaret was waiting in my office, sitting in my chair with the kind of comfortable authority that reminded me she'd once run an entire city. Her expression was carefully neutral, which in my experience meant she was prepared to be either understanding or devastating, depending on how the conversation unfolded. "Robert," she said without preamble, "I've been reviewing our records and I'm having trouble reconciling some discrepancies. We have medical expenses for a dog named Cooper, but no corresponding kennel assignment for the past 3 weeks. We have daily care logs for the same dog, but they're all signed by you personally rather than our regular staff. And we have adoption applications being processed for every other animal in our facility except this one." I sat down in the visitor's chair across from my own desk, feeling like a student called to the principal's office. Cooper, apparently sensing tension, moved closer to my side and sat down with his shoulder pressed against my leg. "Cooper has been recovering at my apartment," I said, deciding that complete honesty was my only viable strategy. His injuries required around-the-clock care that we couldn't provide within the shelter environment, and I felt that a quiet, stable setting would be more conducive to his psychological healing, as well as his physical recovery. Margaret studied Cooper with the kind of careful assessment that had probably served her well in municipal politics. I watched her take in his alert posture, his glossy coat, the way he maintained eye contact without fear or aggression. After what felt like an eternity, she looked back at me. "This is highly irregular, Robert. Taking shelter animals home for extended periods isn't just against our policies. It raises questions about our insurance coverage, our liability, and our commitment to treating all animals in our care equally. She was right, of course. Everything about the past 6 weeks had been irregular. From my initial decision to authorize expensive surgery for a dog with limited adoption prospects to my subsequent choice to provide care in my own home, I'd violated protocols I'd helped write, made decisions that prioritized emotion over efficiency, and used resources in ways that couldn't be replicated for every animal that needed help. "You're absolutely right," I said, my hand moving automatically to rest on Cooper's head. "I've made decisions that go against established policies, and I take full responsibility for that. But I'd make the same choices again." "Robert?" Margaret's voice softened slightly, taking on the tone of someone who was genuinely trying to understand rather than simply criticize. "No one questions your dedication or your results. In 12 years, you've built this shelter into something the entire community is proud of. But we can't operate based on emotional decisions. We have to have standards, protocols, systems that work for every situation." Before I could respond, Dr. Peterson appeared in the doorway, still wearing her surgical scrubs and carrying a folder thick with medical documentation. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I wanted to provide you with Cooper's complete medical report before your meeting." She handed the folder to Margaret, then knelt down to examine Cooper with the thorough professionalism that had made her one of the most respected veterinarians in 3 counties. Cooper accepted her attention with tail-wagging enthusiasm, even lifting each paw in turn as if presenting them for inspection. "Remarkable recovery," Dr. Peterson announced, standing up with a smile that transformed her entire face. "Complete healing of all lacerations, full range of motion restored, muscle mass rebuilt to normal levels. From a medical standpoint, this is one of the most successful rehabilitation cases I've seen in 20 years of practice." Margaret opened the folder and began reading through the reports, her expression gradually changing from stern administrator to something closer to wonder. "According to this," she said slowly, "his transformation has been extraordinary." "It has," Dr. Peterson agreed. "But the physical healing is actually the least impressive part. When Cooper first arrived, he showed all the signs of severe trauma: social withdrawal, hypervigilance, learned helplessness. Dogs in that condition often require months or years of specialized behavioral rehabilitation, and many never fully recover their ability to trust humans." She gestured toward Cooper, who had now relaxed enough to lie down with his head resting on my foot, his eyes peacefully closed. "This level of psychological healing doesn't happen in a kennel environment, no matter how well managed. It requires the kind of consistent, patient, one-on-one attention that Robert has provided. In my professional opinion, Cooper's recovery is a direct result of the care he's received in a stable home environment." Margaret closed the folder and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "The medical expenses have been substantial." "They have," I agreed. "But every penny has been documented and justified. And the truth is, Margaret, the bulk of his care, the daily bandage changes, the medication administration, the physical therapy, the emotional rehabilitation, all of that has been provided at no cost to the shelter because I've done it in my own time, in my own home." "Which brings us to the real issue," Margaret said, her voice taking on that careful tone that preceded difficult conversations. "What happens now? Cooper has clearly bonded with you, and you with him. Our policies exist for a reason, Robert. If staff members start taking animals home, where does it end? How do we maintain any kind of system or fairness?" The question hung in the air between us, and I realized that this was the moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for since the day I'd first looked into Cooper's eyes. This was where I had to choose between the job I'd dedicated 12 years of my life to building and the dog who had somehow found a way to heal my soul while I was healing his body. "I want to adopt him," I said, the words emerging with a clarity that surprised me. "Officially, through the proper channels, with all the paperwork and fees that any other adopter would pay." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "That's actually the most logical solution, but it does set a precedent that could complicate future situations." "Not necessarily," Dr. Peterson interjected. "What if we formalize this? Established a medical foster program for animals requiring extensive rehabilitation? Robert has proven that home-based care can produce remarkable results. We could develop criteria for when this kind of intervention is appropriate, create protocols for monitoring and documentation, and train qualified volunteers to provide similar care for future cases." I felt a surge of gratitude toward Dr. Peterson for finding a way to transform my impulsive, emotional decision into something that could benefit the shelter long term. But more than that, I felt a profound sense of relief at the possibility that I wouldn't have to choose between my commitment to helping animals in general and my love for this one animal in particular. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying Cooper with renewed interest. Finally, she spoke. "There's a board meeting scheduled for next Tuesday. I want you to prepare a comprehensive proposal for this medical foster program. Criteria, protocols, budget implications, everything. And I want Cooper to be there as your case study." She stood up, gathering her papers with the efficient movements of someone who had made a decision and was ready to move forward. "If you can convince the board that this approach has merit beyond just this one case, and if you're willing to formalize your adoption of Cooper through the proper channels, then I think we might have the foundation for something that could really enhance our mission." As she walked toward the door, she paused and looked back at Cooper, who had gotten up to follow her movement with polite interest. "He really is remarkable, isn't he? It's hard to believe this is the same dog that was brought in 6 weeks ago." After she left, I sat in my office with Cooper at my side, feeling like the ground beneath my feet had shifted in the most wonderful way possible. Not only was I going to be able to keep Cooper, but our journey together might actually help other animals in similar situations. Sometimes, it seemed, the most impulsive decisions turned out to be the ones that opened doors you never knew existed. Cooper nudged my hand with his nose, and when I looked down at him, I could swear he was smiling. We still had a board meeting to get through, still had protocols to develop and policies to write. But for the first time since this whole adventure began, I felt like we were exactly where we belonged, together, and ready to help others find their way home too. The board meeting started well. Cooper had charmed everyone within the first 5 minutes, demonstrating his impeccable manners by greeting each board member politely, sitting quietly during the presentations, and somehow managing to look both dignified and endearing as I outlined the proposed medical foster program. Margaret had done her homework, presenting financial projections that showed how home-based rehabilitation could actually reduce long-term costs while improving outcomes. Dr. Peterson provided compelling medical evidence, and even Tom Bradley seemed convinced by the business case for expanding our services. But then the phone rang. Sarah's voice carried that particular urgency that made my stomach drop before she even finished her first sentence. "Robert, you need to get back here immediately. We have a situation with the Henderson family." I excused myself from the meeting, promising to return as quickly as possible, and drove back to the shelter with Cooper riding anxiously beside me, somehow sensing that the calm we'd established was about to be disrupted. What I found when I arrived made my blood run cold. The Hendersons' 8-year-old son, Michael, was sitting in our front office with tears streaming down his face. His breathing labored despite the inhaler clutched in his small hands. His parents flanked him, their faces bearing the exhausted desperation of people who had run out of options. And lying at their feet, looking confused and heartbroken, was Princess, the golden retriever they'd brought in for surrender. "We tried everything," Mrs. Henderson was saying to Sarah, her voice breaking. "The allergist said there's been no improvement, and last night Michael ended up in the emergency room again. We can't keep putting him through this." I knelt down beside Michael, who looked up at me with eyes red from crying and allergic reactions in equal measure. "Hey, buddy," I said gently. "I know this is really hard. I don't want to give Princess away," he whispered, his words punctuated by the wheezing that spoke to the severity of his condition. "She's my best friend. We got her when I was little, and she always sleeps in my room, and she knows all my secrets." The raw pain in his voice hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a family callously discarding an inconvenient pet. This was a family being torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. And Princess, who had never known anything but love and security, was about to be thrust into a world she couldn't possibly understand. "I know she's special," I said, reaching out to scratch Princess behind the ears. She leaned into the touch but kept her worried eyes on Michael, clearly sensing his distress. "And I promise you we're going to find her a family who will love her just as much as you do." But even as I said the words, I could see the doubt in his eyes. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that sometimes love means letting go? How do you convince a child that the dog who has been his constant companion for most of his life will be happy somewhere else? The Hendersons completed the surrender paperwork with hands that shook, Mrs. Henderson stopping frequently to wipe away tears. When it came time to say goodbye, Michael threw his arms around Princess's neck and whispered something in her ear, that made her tail wag despite the confusion she must have been feeling. Then he ran to the car, unable to watch as his father handed me the leash that would lead Princess to her kennel. The rest of the day passed in a blur of emotional devastation. Princess paced her kennel constantly, whining and looking toward the door with the expectation that her family would come back for her. Every time a car pulled into the parking lot, she would perk up with hope that broke my heart a little more. She refused to eat, barely drank water, and seemed to be aging before my eyes as the reality of abandonment set in. Cooper, who had been with me through every minute of this ordeal, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He stayed close to Princess's kennel, occasionally pressing his nose against the chain link in what appeared to be an attempt at comfort. If I hadn't known better, I would have sworn he was trying to tell her that things would get better, that love could return even after it seemed lost forever. But the worst was yet to come. 3 days later, just as Princess was beginning to eat small amounts and show tentative interest in the volunteers who visited her kennel, I received a call that changed everything. The Hendersons' insurance company had contacted our legal department. Apparently, there was some question about liability regarding Michael's allergic reactions. If it could be proven that the family had knowingly kept a dog despite their child's severe allergies, their health insurance might not cover the mounting medical expenses. The implication was clear. They needed documentation that Princess had been surrendered for behavioral reasons, not medical ones. They needed us to falsify the surrender paperwork to protect their insurance coverage and their son's access to continued treatment. I stared at the legal documents spread across my desk, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. The Hendersons weren't bad people. They were desperate parents trying to protect their child's health and their family's financial future. But what they were asking me to do would not only be illegal, it would also make Princess virtually unadoptable. A dog with a documented history of behavioral problems would be passed over by every potential family in favor of animals with clean records. "What are you going to do?" Dr. Peterson asked when I explained the situation to her. We were standing outside Princess's kennel, watching her lie listlessly on her bed, still waiting for a family that would never come back. "I don't know," I admitted. "If I refuse to falsify the records, the Hendersons could lose their insurance coverage, and Michael might not get the medical care he needs. But if I change the surrender reason to behavioral issues, Princess will probably never find a home. And if the board finds out you falsified official documents?" I didn't need to answer that question. We both knew that falsifying surrender paperwork would be grounds for immediate termination and possibly criminal charges. Everything I'd worked for, everything the shelter represented, everything Cooper and I had been building toward with the medical foster program, all of it would be destroyed. That night, I sat in my apartment with Cooper curled up beside me, staring at the legal documents and trying to find a solution that didn't exist. Outside, the November wind howled around the building, and inside, the weight of impossible choices pressed down on my shoulders like a physical burden. Cooper seemed to sense my distress. He moved closer, resting his head on my lap and looking up at me with those coffee-brown eyes that had become my anchor in a world that often felt like it was spinning out of control. In those eyes I saw trust, love, and something that looked like encouragement. He had survived betrayal, abandonment, and pain that should have broken him permanently. But somehow, he had found the strength to trust again, to love again, to hope again. Looking at him, I realized that he had taught me something crucial about the nature of choice. Sometimes the right decision isn't the easy one or the safe one, or the one that makes financial sense. Sometimes the right decision is the one that honors the fundamental dignity of every soul involved, regardless of the cost. I picked up my phone and dialed the Hendersons' number. Mrs. Henderson answered on the second ring, and I could hear the hope and desperation in her voice as she said hello. "Mrs. Henderson," I said, my voice steady despite the fear churning in my stomach. "I've reviewed your request, and I need you to know that I can't falsify Princess's surrender records. But I have another proposal that might help both your family and Princess." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening, but I pressed on. "What if I adopted Princess myself? That way Michael could visit her whenever he wanted, and she could still be part of your family's life, just not in your home. The surrender would remain documented as a medical necessity, which is the truth, and your insurance situation wouldn't be compromised." When Mrs. Henderson finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears. "You would do that? You would take Princess so Michael could still see her?" Looking down at Cooper, who was still watching me with those wise, trusting eyes, I felt something settle into place that had been shifting and uncertain for weeks. Yes, I said, I would do that. Because sometimes love means finding a way to keep families together, even when they can't live in the same house. As I hung up the phone, I realized that my small apartment was about to become home to 2 dogs who had taught me more about resilience, love, and the true meaning of family than 12 years of shelter management ever had. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new paperwork, new questions from the board about my decision-making process. But tonight, with Cooper's warm weight against my side, and the promise of Princess's visits with Michael in the near future, everything felt like it was exactly as it should be. Sometimes the hardest choices turn out to be the ones that open your heart wide enough to hold more love than you ever thought possible. The morning I brought Princess home to join Cooper and me, the dynamic of our small household shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated. Cooper, who had spent the past 2 months as my sole companion, watched with alert interest as I carried Princess's belongings up the apartment stairs. Her bed, her favorite toys, the blue collar with tiny silver bones that Michael had picked out for her 3rd birthday, all the artifacts of a life that had been loving and secure until circumstances made it impossible. Princess entered the apartment with the cautious dignity of a dog who had learned that familiar things could disappear without warning. She explored each room methodically, sniffing corners and checking behind furniture with the thoroughness of someone conducting a security assessment. Cooper followed at a respectful distance, neither intrusive nor aloof, somehow understanding that she needed space to process this new reality. The first few days were challenging in ways I hadn't expected. Princess ate reluctantly, and only when I sat beside her food bowl, as if she needed constant reassurance that this meal wouldn't be her last. She slept fitfully, often waking in the middle of the night to pace the apartment, checking and rechecking the doors and windows. And most heartbreakingly, she would sometimes sit by the front door for hours, clearly waiting for the family that wasn't coming back. Cooper's response to her distress was nothing short of remarkable. This dog, who had survived abandonment and trauma that should have made him wary of sharing resources or affection, seemed to understand exactly what Princess needed. When she was too anxious to eat, he would eat from his own bowl first, then walk away, somehow communicating that food was safe and abundant. When she paced at night, he would follow quietly, not intruding but making sure she wasn't alone. And when she stationed herself by the door in hopeful vigil, he would settle nearby, a calm presence that seemed to say, I understand, and you're not alone. The breakthrough came on day 6 when Michael Henderson made his first visit. I had arranged with his parents to meet at a local park where the outdoor air would minimize his allergic reactions while still allowing him to spend time with Princess. The moment she saw him getting out of his family's car, Princess transformed from a depressed, listless dog into pure joy and motion. Her tail wagged with such vigor that her entire body seemed to vibrate with happiness, and the whines that emerged from her throat were the sounds of a soul recognizing its missing piece. Michael ran toward her as fast as his inhaler-dependent lungs would allow, and when they collided in the middle of the park's open field, I had to turn away for a moment to collect myself. The reunion was everything beautiful and everything heartbreaking about love, the pure joy of connection, and the underlying knowledge that it was temporary. She looks good, Mrs. Henderson said, coming to stand beside me as we watched Michael and Princess play fetch with a tennis ball that had seen better days. Healthier than when we brought her to the shelter. She's finding her way, I replied, watching Cooper join the game, running alongside Princess with the kind of easy camaraderie that suggested they were becoming true friends. It takes time to heal from that kind of loss. We can't thank you enough for this, Mr. Henderson added, his voice thick with emotion. When we thought we were losing her forever, that we'd never see her again. He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Watching Michael's face as he threw the ball for both dogs, seeing the way Princess stayed close enough to touch him even while playing, I understood something fundamental about love that I'd never grasped before. Love isn't diminished by being shared across households or circumstances. If anything, it grows stronger when it finds ways to persist despite obstacles. Over the following weeks, we established a routine that worked for everyone involved. Michael visited twice a week, once at the park and once at my apartment during times when his allergies were well controlled with medication. Princess began to understand that these visits were regular and reliable, which seemed to ease her anxiety about abandonment. She started eating normally, sleeping through the night, and showing interest in her new life while still maintaining her special bond with Michael. Cooper thrived in this new dynamic. Having another dog in the house seemed to awaken playful instincts that had been dormant during his healing process. They developed elaborate games that involved chasing each other around the apartment furniture, engaging in gentle wrestling matches that were carefully calibrated to avoid putting pressure on Cooper's still sensitive paws, and competing to see who could bring me the most impressive collection of toys when I came home from work. But the most remarkable development was how they worked together to help other dogs. Word had spread through the shelter community about the success of our little pack, and Dr. Peterson began bringing some of the more challenging cases to my apartment for socialization visits. Dogs who were too fearful or aggressive for the shelter environment often responded well to Cooper and Princess's calm confidence. They seemed to serve as interpreters, helping traumatized animals understand that humans could be trusted and that life could be good again. The medical foster program that had started as a way to justify Cooper's unconventional recovery had evolved into something larger and more impactful than I'd ever imagined. We now had 6 trained foster families providing home-based rehabilitation for animals with special needs. Princess and Cooper had become unofficial ambassadors for the program, demonstrating to potential foster families that the work was challenging but transformative. One particularly memorable afternoon, we were working with a German Shepherd mix named Rex, who had been found tied to a tree and left to starve. He was so fearful of humans that he couldn't be handled for routine medical care, and we were running out of options for helping him. But when I brought him to my apartment for a trial visit, Cooper and Princess flanked him like bodyguards, positioning themselves between Rex and me in a way that seemed to communicate, "This human is safe. We vouch for him." Within an hour, Rex was allowing me to sit in the same room. Within 3 hours, he was taking treats from my hand. By the end of the week, he was ready to return to the shelter for adoption preparation. The transformation wasn't miraculous or supernatural. It was simply the result of traumatized souls helping each other heal through the power of shared experience and unconditional acceptance. The success of these interventions caught the attention of animal welfare organizations throughout the region. We started receiving requests to help with difficult cases from shelters as far as 2 hours away. The board, initially skeptical of my emotional decision-making, was now fully supportive of what had become a nationally recognized program for animal rehabilitation. But the real measure of our success wasn't found in recognition or accolades. It was found in quiet moments like the one I experienced on a snowy Thursday evening in December. I was sitting on my couch reading through applications from families who wanted to adopt some of our recently rehabilitated dogs, when I looked up to find Cooper and Princess lying on their respective beds, both watching me with expressions of complete contentment. These were 2 dogs who had every reason to be fearful, aggressive, or permanently damaged by their experiences with abandonment and loss. Instead, they had chosen to trust again, to love again, to open their hearts wide enough to help other animals find their way back to hope. In doing so, they had taught me that healing isn't something you do alone. It's something you do in community, surrounded by souls who understand your journey because they've walked similar paths. As I looked at my little pack, my family, I realized that the scared, lonely man who had first encountered a wounded dog in Kennel 34 barely existed anymore. In his place was someone who understood that love multiplies when it's shared, that hope grows stronger when it's tested, and that sometimes the most broken souls have the greatest capacity for healing others. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new animals in need of help, new families looking for second chances. But tonight, in this warm apartment where 2 rescued dogs had become the foundation of something larger than themselves, I felt the deep peace that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. 2 years later, I stood in the same kennel where I'd first encountered Cooper, but this time I wasn't alone. Cooper and Princess flanked me on either side, their calm presence serving as a bridge between fear and hope for the newest arrival to our medical foster program. The dog before us was an elderly Labrador mix named Duke, brought in with injuries that told a story of neglect and abandonment that was all too familiar. 14 years old, Dr. Peterson reported, her voice carrying the professional compassion that had made her one of the most respected veterinarians in 3 states. Severe arthritis, untreated dental disease, and what appears to be chronic malnutrition. The family that surrendered him said they'd had him since he was a puppy, but they couldn't afford his medical care anymore. I knelt down slowly, remembering my first encounter with Cooper in this same spot. Duke's eyes held the same exhaustion, The same resignation, but also something I'd learned to recognize over the past 2 years. A flicker of hope that refused to be completely extinguished. "What do you think, guys?" I asked Cooper and Princess, who had both moved closer to Duke's kennel. Their response was immediate and unanimous, tails wagging, gentle whines of encouragement, and the kind of body language that said, "We understand, and it's going to be okay." The Pine Valley Animal Shelter had changed dramatically since that first board meeting where I'd defended my decision to save Cooper. The medical foster program now served as a model for organizations across the country. We had 15 trained foster families, a specialized rehabilitation facility funded by donations from people who had heard our story, and a waiting list of volunteers who wanted to help animals with special needs. But more than the physical changes, there had been a fundamental shift in how we approached animal welfare. We no longer saw severely injured or traumatized animals as hopeless cases requiring immediate euthanasia. Instead, we saw them as individuals with stories worth preserving, souls with the capacity for healing, and teachers who could help other animals learn to trust again. Margaret Thornton, now in her 3rd year as board president, had become one of our program's strongest advocates. The woman who had once questioned the wisdom of spending thousands of dollars on a single dog now regularly spoke at conferences about the economic and social benefits of comprehensive rehabilitation programs. "Robert," she said, joining me at Duke's kennel. "The Morrison family called this morning. They're ready to take Duke as soon as he's cleared for foster placement." The Morrisons were experienced foster parents who specialized in senior dogs. Their own elderly golden retriever had passed away 6 months earlier, and they'd been waiting for the right dog to help fill the hole in their hearts. Duke, with his gentle temperament and need for specialized care, seemed like a perfect match. "And there's something else," Margaret continued, her voice taking on the tone she used when she had particularly good news to share. "The National Animal Welfare Foundation wants to feature our program in their annual report. They're calling it revolutionary and suggesting that it should be replicated nationwide." I felt a surge of pride, not for the recognition, but for what it represented. 2 years ago, the decision to save Cooper had seemed like an impulsive act of compassion that might cost me my career. Now, that same decision had become the foundation for a program that was helping thousands of animals across the country find their way back to hope. But the real measure of our success wasn't found in national recognition or impressive statistics. It was found in the quiet transformations that happened one soul at a time, like the one unfolding before us as Cooper approached Duke's kennel and touched his nose to the older dog's paw in a gesture of solidarity that transcended species barriers. The afternoon sun was streaming through the shelter windows when I loaded Duke into my car for the drive to his foster home. Cooper and Princess had come along for the ride, as they often did when we were transitioning new animals to their rehabilitation placements. During the 20-minute drive, I watched in the rearview mirror as Duke gradually relaxed between his 2 companions, their presence seeming to communicate that this journey was leading somewhere safe. The Morrisons' house was a single-story ranch home with a fenced yard and a sunroom that would be perfect for an elderly dog's recovery. Mrs. Morrison, a retired nurse, greeted us at the door with the kind of warm competence that immediately put both humans and animals at ease. "Oh, Duke," she said softly, kneeling down to his level. "You've had a rough time, haven't you? But that's all behind you now." As we helped Duke settle into his new temporary home, complete with an orthopedic bed positioned to catch the afternoon sun and elevated food bowls to ease the strain on his arthritic joints, I reflected on the journey that had brought us all to this moment. Cooper, who now served as an unofficial therapy dog for newly arrived animals, had gone from being a broken, abandoned creature that most people had written off as hopeless to becoming a symbol of resilience and second chances. His story had been featured in magazines, documentaries, and children's books about the healing power of love. But more importantly, he had helped dozens of other animals learn to trust again, serving as living proof that survival was possible even after the worst kind of betrayal. Princess had found her own calling in our extended family. Her gentle nature and patient temperament made her perfect for working with fearful dogs, and her continued relationship with Michael Henderson had become a model for how families could maintain connections with beloved pets, even when circumstances made cohabitation impossible. Michael, now 10 years old and managing his allergies more effectively, visited twice a week and had become one of our most dedicated young volunteers. As for me, I had discovered that the lonely, isolated man who had once lived for nothing but work had been replaced by someone with a rich, complex family that included not just Cooper and Princess, but the extended network of foster families, volunteers, and rehabilitated animals that had grown around our initial act of faith. The drive home from the Morrisons' house was conducted in comfortable silence, with Cooper and Princess sleeping peacefully in the back seat, and the satisfaction of another successful placement warming my chest like sunlight. As we pulled into my apartment complex, I realized that this place had become something I'd never thought possible. A true home, filled with love that multiplied rather than diminished when it was shared. That evening, as I sat on my couch with my laptop updating Duke's case file and reviewing applications for the next batch of medical foster placements, Cooper and Princess settled into their usual positions at my feet. The apartment was quiet except for the soft sounds of their breathing and the gentle click of computer keys. But it was the kind of peaceful quiet that comes from knowing you're surrounded by souls who understand your journey because they've walked similar paths. Looking at Cooper, whose scars had faded but whose wisdom had only deepened, I thought about that first moment in Kennel 34 when I'd seen something in his eyes that changed everything. At the time, I'd thought I was saving him. Now I understood that he had been saving me. From loneliness, from cynicism, from the gradual hardening of heart that can happen when you spend your days confronting the worst of human nature. But perhaps most importantly, he had taught me that healing isn't a destination you reach. It's a journey you take together, one paw print at a time, surrounded by the kind of love that refuses to give up even when hope seems impossible. As the evening settled around us and my two dogs drifted off to sleep, I felt the deep contentment that comes from knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new animals in need of help, new opportunities to prove that love really can triumph over circumstance. And whatever tomorrow brought, we would face it together, a pack formed not by blood or breed, but by the shared understanding that every soul deserves a second chance, and that sometimes the most broken hearts have the greatest capacity for healing others. In the end, that's what Cooper had taught me, that love isn't a finite resource that gets depleted when shared. It's a renewable energy that grows stronger each time it's given away, creating ripples of hope that extend far beyond anything we could imagine when we first choose to open our hearts to a wounded soul who needs us to believe in second chances. The boy with the wounded paws had indeed been laughed at, dismissed, and written off by most of the world. But in the end, he had gotten the last laugh. Not because he'd proven anyone wrong, but because he'd proven that love, patience, and the willingness to fight for one broken soul could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities of hearts ready to believe in the possibility of healing. And that, I realized as I drifted off to sleep with my pack around me, was the most beautiful kind of victory of all.